As concept artists, we need to develop pipelines and processes in order for our work to be consistent and efficient. And so in this video, I want to break down this environment concept art that I did using one of my favorite processes, which is going back and forth from the 3D using Blender and 2D using Photoshop. Let's get started. Now, this particular concept here was done for our newly released course Foundations. Now, this course will show you everything that you need to know to get started as an environment concept artist, from the very fundamentals of digital art and environment design to best practices and studies, and also to work off of briefs like this one in order to develop your ideas and designs. Now, everything starts with the initial idea, right? And at this point where we were making this concept art, we already have some rules, we have some guidelines, and we already have sort of the idea established for our concept. Now, one of those things is that we know that these concepts that we're doing for this is going to be for a sort of like a role-playing fantasy dungeon crawling game. And so that sort of defines what the end product is going to be. And the brief itself, in a specific, is to design a stage or some sort of area where our character is going to reach and do sort of like a checkpoint right before a boss. And that sort of gives you an idea of the function of this place, right? And we also have like some references and previously done concept art that we did for the exact, same sort of area. So we are using all of this in order to develop this new idea. If you don't have any of these rules and guidelines at the beginning, I really, really strongly suggest that you have some sort of guidelines in order for you to guide your design, right? And normally I like to start with the end product in mind, right? So why am I doing this particular artwork that I'm doing? Is it for a background for a 2D animation? Is it for a game? Is it for a movie set? And so that already starts giving me some sort of guideline and suggestions on how I'm going to tackle this particular design. And you could go even further about the specifics of this product, like maybe the genre, maybe the time period. Is it rooted in historical architecture, etc.? And so having those rules and sort of quote unquote limitations help you make decisions based on those limitations and guidelines in order for you to develop this new design. For example, it's really not the same to develop concept art for a platformer game like Ori than creating artwork or concept environments for a dungeon crawler like Diablo 4 or Path of Exile #2. And you can see how these two are a little bit different in terms of the presentation of them, because this is how the player or the character is going to experience this environment. And so we have to take that into consideration when creating these concepts based on the end product in mind. So going back to our design here, the main pipeline that I use is going from 3D to 2D, back to the 3D, then going back to the 2D. And so as much as needed, going back and forth from both tools in there. And this is sort of like a progression that you can see here of the development of this particular scene here. Now you can see this is a very basic model, a sketch over, go back to the 3D to develop all the ideas that we had here, and then creating the scene, adding some lighting in 3D and creating a 3D render, and then finishing the render back into the 2D, adding everything that's needed and left in order to finish our design here. But I want to break down each of these steps with you here. Now, our first step will be a very basic 3D model of this. You can use Blender, Maya, whatever your choice is. But this is just to get you started. Now, in some productions, especially in video games, sometimes you are provided with this sort of block gray box model by one of the 3D artists or a level game designer. And so it could be something as super simple as a couple boxes and cylinders, or it could be a little bit more complex, similar to what we have going on here in our scene. Now, the idea here is to really keep it as simple as possible in this first stage. Use primitive shapes, very simple modeling. Do not think about the medium and small details, because the point of this is to really get the big shapes and general space, not concerning with details, lighting, or even materials at this point. So right now, all I care is about the general sense of the space and how much space I have to work with or the player has to work with in order to design this. Now, once we have this, we can take either a screenshot from the camera or do a regular render from our camera. I'll suggest leaving the camera intact so we can always go back to the same shot. And now we can take that image into Photoshop. I'm not thinking about render passes or materials or any lighting at this point. And using what I have, I want to be as rough as possible to start designing some of the key things of this environment. Again, I'm only worried about the bigger things and issues of the space, like what's the path the character can take and direction. Maybe I have some stairs in a few areas where I'm going to place some of the main props of the space, like the checkpoint stone, some treasure chests, or maybe some upgrades for the character before the boss fight. And so how I'm going to break some of the main pieces of the ground, etc. So I'm really just worried about the bigger things of the space at first. Now that I have a more clear idea on the general space, I can start thinking and figure out the medium and small issues of the design space that I have. And the way I'm doing that is by using my previous sketch as a base and cleaning it up and thinking about those smaller things. I'm thinking about the groundstone patterns. I'm thinking about maybe I could have some banners in the space, the design of the floor in front of the checkpoint. Do I have railings and how I break them up? The texture on the side walls, what sort of materials, the layering of the different materials I could have on the ground from the main stone, maybe some wood, dirt, gravel, etc. And I try to think about this as much of that as possible and try to figure it out at this stage. But notice that the drawing is still very rough because it doesn't need to be super clean for me to know what it is. This is more my schematic and my reference for when I go back into the 3D and build everything that I have here in the sketch for the final render. Now, before I go into the final render, I wanted to show you one of my favorite critical steps that I normally do before going into the final 3D step, right? So we have our basic model, right? We did our very rough initial sketch to just kind of get a general idea. We refined the sketch to sort of note smaller things in the space. But now I always like to go in and make notes about the things that I need to do on my next step. And so you can see that I have some sort of like a note layer here where I'm sort of pointing out the things that I need to get done. And this could be from new props or things that are going to be in the environment, like this rack of weapons, maybe some wood planks in here, some new banners that I need to design over here. Maybe this is like a separate area for a power-up item. I'm also thinking about how I am separating some of the materials. So I'm thinking that I have this sort of pattern here on the ground to sort of let the character know or the player know that this is the path that they need to take, right? And so I'm using materials and material separation in order for me to hint that in the space in itself. I'm also adding some of these treasure chests that we already built on the course, but I'm also using the previous concepts that I've done already in order for me to reference maybe some materials or particular parts of the environment that I want to have in the space, just to kind of use them as reference in there. And lastly, I'm also adding some other sort of little details here on the ground and the railings. And what this does to me is sort of creates a general sense for a list of things that I need to take care of in the next step. And that way facilitates my understanding of the things that I need to get done, sort of like in a list setting, which is a lot easier for me to go through. And so this particular stage is super important for me. It only takes me a couple minutes just to kind of go through it and actually have it in a visual image form for me to always go back and reference as I'm building the 3D for this part. And now it's just a matter of putting the time and translate what I have in that sketch into my 3D space. Now we have already built some props already from previous modules before, as well as the materials. And so now we're technically using our sketch as a guide, and we populate and create and layer all these things from the sketch into the environment. Once we have most of the items in here, we add some lights and create some sort of mood. And finally, we create our final render with the render passes that then we'll take into Photoshop to finish up. Now, from the render, we really have a lot of information. This is one of those cases where we have a lot of information from it, right? Every time I have or I work with an image like this where there's so much information, I normally have a couple of steps that I work with, right? And so I don't want to redo or anything or redesign anything big at this stage. Inside Photoshop, if I need to, I'll go back into the 3D and do that and re-render it, which you will see later. But what I want to do, my main focal here now, is to really enhance what I have. And so my first step is always going to be a color correction. So this is our raw render from Blender. And so using color curves, render passes, diffuse, and color balance, I always like to work my mood as close to the final as possible, or my view of what that will look like. And so I like to simplify a lot of the stuff in the background, create a more accurate mood than from what I have in my mind for this particular set. Now, next step is I do a paint over for on my scene, and this is where I really just relax and use everything that I have in the space to add more detail and define certain things. So for example, you can see here on the steps that from the render, we have this really blocky sand texture here. And so I'm using that painted layer in order for me to create a little bit more interesting shapes and also fix some of the behavior of this particular sand. And you can see some of that going around as well. And so I go throughout the whole image painting things, like for example, this sand waterfalls that I've added here, right? I'm simplifying some of the values as well. So you can see that back here, there's really hot highlights back here. I try to simplify those a little bit, right? Push them back just so they don't attract as much attention. And so I go through the whole image painting and using the values and textures that I already have in the scene for me to develop it further. After that, I do a photo bash step through, and in this case I don't need to do as much because we are getting quite a lot of texture from the textures from the 3D. And so the purpose for this one in particular was just to add the webs, the spider web sort of effects into the environment as much as needed. So you can see going around, it's, in some areas it's very, very subtle, right? But you can see how I'm adding those using photo bashing techniques. After that, I do another painted over, which I'm trying to define certain aspects of the design as well. So I'm defining some of the areas on the ground. You can see over here, defining some of the stairs as well. And also just doing a second run on this environment in order for me to add anything. I added some of those power-ups effects that we're going to have in the space. Added some back here as well, right? And then from there, we're almost done. But as you can see here, we have our banners that are from the original model. Now I made these in VR, but I wanted to create something more unique to the space. Now this was a particular case where I wanted to go back and actually concentrate on the design of this particular prop that we are missing from this space, right? And so I wanted to go back in and really take some time to design this new banner. And so the process was very straightforward, right? I did a couple sketches here just to kind of explore different options. And then I went and took those. I did a sort of like a mix and match of the things that I like from some of them and the things that I didn't like. And so from that, using this as a reference, I built it up in 3D in Blender, textured it, and did a final concept call out for this particular prop. Now, since I have it in the 3D, now I went back into the actual scene in 3D, placed it, and re-render it into my scene. And I just needed to mask out the areas that I wanted, which is just the the banners in itself, and I added them into the space here, so you can see here. And so this was an example of how I go back to the original 3D render with new information or a new model added in, and then place it on my Photoshop file in order to continue the process of this. And once I have that, then it was just a matter of putting everything together and doing sort of like a final touches sort of layer. And so this contains a final setup for color correction if needed. I added some lights effects that you can see here coming from the main light source, which is coming from the right side. Added some effects here on the stone here, and also added a character here just for scale purposes and really just for fun in here as well. So this is the end of this particular pipeline and process that I like to use quite often in my day-to-day job as a concept artist. Again, this course Foundations is available in our website. It covers everything from 0 to 100 if you want to get started as an environment concept artist. And if you like this content, please feel free to subscribe or like. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I'll see you guys in the next one.